The world death rate is holding steady at 100%. The Onion is a satirical journal, so it's their job to make fun of us as we try to hide from mortality. What would happen if we turned toward loss instead of running from it? What if grief has something to teach us? In 2008, my husband and best friend died. Vic was my harbor and safety net. So what did I learn from that loss? To answer that question, I have to go way back to my first childhood memory. I was small. I stood near my mother, who was lying face down on a wooden bench. Her eyes were hidden in her hands, but I could tell she was crying because her back was heaving up and down. Her sobs scared me, but I didn't call out to her. Instead, I was captivated by rays of colored light coming from above, dancing off the walls and filling the space. Soft color covered my mother's back, my little arms, everything. I didn't understand the experience then, and I don't understand it conceptually now, but I felt protected by that light. And even as a child, I knew my mother couldn't feel the protection because her face was turned away from it. I learned as an adult that I'd been under 3 when that happened. My father was in a Catholic hospital, and he was expected to die. My mother had taken me with her to the hospital chapel, so the light came from stained glass windows, and the wooden bench was a pew. Knowing the facts about the experience didn't change its power. I trusted that support was available during grief if I looked for it. My father didn't die at the time. He lived 11 more years, always ill. After his death, when I was 14, my mother felt completely unsupported and was afraid she would drown in grief. So she retreated. She went to work, came home, and went into her bedroom. Although she loved my father, she didn't weep for him, and she didn't speak about him, and didn't want me to speak about him either. While he was lost to death, she was lost to life. When I returned to school, no one mentioned what had happened to me. And after we buried my dad, the family never returned to the cemetery. Of course, I felt distant from my mother and isolated from everyone. My father's empty chair at the dining room table left a huge hole in my heart. 8 years ago, after months of a lingering flu, an oncologist told my husband, Vic, "You likely have lymphoma. I don't know what kind." Vic and I sat in our car in the parking lot, stunned by this news. "Let's not tell anyone," Vic said. "Maybe it'll be nothing. We don't want to worry people over nothing." I took that in, and I turned to him, and I said, "Vic, I don't want to do this alone the way my mother did. I need our sons and our friends. I need all the support I can get. I think you do too." We agreed, but I saw how tempting it is to hide our grief wounds and try to go it alone. Vic died after 2 tough years. A friend took this photo just a few hours before his death. After that last exhalation, there was no inhalation. The end. I was numb and exhausted. But this time I faced grief rather than running from it. I knew it could be my teacher. And I turned where humans have always turned in times of challenging transition. I turned to ritual. It's human to create meaningful ritual. Anthropologists know they've discovered civilization when they find signs of ritual at ancient burial sites. We ritualize weddings and baby showers, baptisms and funerals. We create rites of passage to connect our worldly and our sacred life, to move us from where we are to where we must go. I needed to move from the safety of my marriage through a vast ocean of grief to find the woman I am on my own. Personal ritual helped me make that journey. I knew I needed to accept that Vic's soul had left his body. Now, I'd been there for his last breath, but there's something surreal about death for those of us who aren't around it much. Modern people keep a distance from death and hand it over to hospitals and morticians. We don't wash bodies and lay them out at home the way people did just 100 years ago. Vic died soon after midnight. Friends and I sat with him until morning light. Then I washed his body with warm water and my tears. And I helped shroud him, wrapping and tucking as though he were a baby. I helped put his body in a body bag, and I watched as a young man wheeled him down the hallway toward the hospital morgue. I needed to let him go. I knew that wouldn't be a fast process. It would take a long time, but I could at least set the intention. So the day after his death, I went with a good friend and my oldest son to the crematorium where Vic's body was being held, or to the funeral home until his body was being held for cremation. We lined the cremation box with white soft blanket, and we put photographs of his students, his teachers, his friends, and his family in the box. We surrounded him with flowers and written prayers. Because it's important to stay awake in the after-death experience in many traditions, we put coffee beans in his cremation box, and it made us laugh and weep. And we also put bittersweet chocolate in there and a box of his favorite shape of pasta. I didn't think he'd be hungry. It was symbolic the way ritual is. I didn't even know if it mattered to him, but it mattered to me. Picture this. My son put 2 hawk feathers behind his dad's ears, and we covered it with another soft blanket, closed the lid of the cremation box, and wrote a prayer on top. We had created a traveling cocoon. I knew it would help if I had a sacred place to soothe my grief. Vic had asked to have his ashes put near his favorite red oak tree in our forest, so I thought we'd just scatter them there. But my sons had a much better idea. They dragged large shale and granite stones out of our creek bed to the site, and they dug a shallow hole. I walked out to the woods carrying a small cardboard box I'd received from the crematorium. I opened it for the first time and pulled out a plastic bag of about 1.5 quarts of rough ash the color of yellowed teeth. "Is that all that's left?" my youngest son yelled. "What a ripoff!" And we all started laughing. Vic would have loved that joke. We put his ashes in the earth and we built a cairn on top. And then we sang songs and said prayers and recited favorite poems. And we told many stories about Vic that made us weep, and even more stories that made us laugh. There had been a private memorial service. There'd been a community memorial service just a few days after his death. But this small private family ritual, a few months later, gave me a sacred place surrounded by natural beauty. I still, 6 years later, I still walk to the cairn under the red oak tree with the intention of leaving a little sorrow behind. I want to leave you with 3 things I've learned from loss. I am not in charge. Of course, I never was. But when I stood at the threshold of death, I felt something vast and unknowable, so far beyond my ordinary sense of self. Opening to that mystery was humbling. It made me a little wiser and a little more realistic about our precarious human situation. Love and grief are a package deal. Think of a movie or a song or a book that really sticks with you. Chances are it's about love and also about sorrow. Love ends in loss for the ones left behind, and grief is a natural response to losing what we've cherished. When I pause to remember someone I've lost, grief is right there, but so is love. Ritual soothes and heals more than I ever could have imagined. When I couldn't stand my heartache one more minute, I took my grief for a walk in nature and visited the cairn under the red oak tree. I often left flowers there. I usually left tears. I always felt better. You likely already create personal ritual in your life, even if you don't call it that. At a recent bereavement group, a woman told me, I have a photo of my husband in my bedroom and I put flowers there. And recently I put his cell phone there. And I'm embarrassed to say it made me feel better. You created a personal ritual, I told her. Cell phones contain our personal history, and it turns out many people in the bereavement group were attached to their spouse's cell phones. Cell phones have voices, photographs, calendars, contacts. They're a perfect modern memento. A funeral ritual marks the beginning of the grieving process. But grief doesn't last just a few days. We can keep creating personal rituals for ourselves as long as we want to, as long as they help us. 3 grieving mothers in Atlanta created the Atlanta Walk to Remember to honor their 3 infants who had died. 10 years later, hundreds of people walk with them to remember lost children. So a small personal ritual became a healing community ritual. I committed to writing every day after Vic was diagnosed with cancer because I wanted to remember what was happening to us. After his death, I continued writing because my daily practice had become a healing personal ritual. Years later, my journals led to articles, blogs, and eventually a book. So my small personal ritual led me to a whole new life as a writer. Humans create ritual spontaneously and naturally. Our rituals can be as small as a 30-second pause to remember someone we've lost, or as elaborate as a Hollywood funeral. In shared ritual, we dare to show our grief wounds to each other, even if it's our habit to hide them. Grief opens our hearts, binds us together, and makes us grateful for each other. Through ritual, our grief becomes entwined in love. Grief is a wound, but it's also an opportunity. As the 13th century poet Rilke says, the wound is the place where the light enters you. Thank you.